Before we wrap up today's visit, was there anything else you wanted to talk about? I've been watching birth videos on YouTube, and I feel drawn to the idea of a home birth. I read on the AOM website that midwives in Ontario can deliver babies at home. So I spoke with my husband, but both him and my mom feel strongly against it. What were their concerns? They think it's dangerous, and if anything were to happen to me or the baby, we'd die waiting for an ambulance. It's not uncommon to think this, especially for people who haven't had an opportunity to learn more about home birth. In Ontario, we are quite lucky that our rates of negative outcomes for pregnant people and their babies is very low. Home and birth centers also have much lower rates of obstetrical complications. What sort of complications do you mean? Well, things like postpartum hemorrhage, trauma to your perineum, and episiotomy occur much less often at home and birth centers than in a hospital. Home births also have a higher rate of spontaneous vaginal birth, which is something you said you wanted. Absolutely. And at the end of the day, hospitals and homes share similar complication rates. I know Paolo likes statistics, so one stat that I have that looks at home birth and hospital birth mortality has found that if 1,000 babies are born at home and 1,000 are born in a hospital, in each case, 998 will live well beyond 28 days, no matter where they are born. Studies have also shown that there's no difference in the risk of mortality when it comes to comparing home births with midwives to planned hospital births with midwives. And these findings are echoed in both the United Kingdom and in the Netherlands. That's reassuring, but what if something does happen? I read that sometimes midwives don't want to make a call to go to the hospital because they don't have privileges and they're not always certain. Stories you're reading come from the States. In the USA, midwifery is not regulated, and some midwives barely have any experience and only need to attend something like 20 births with a preceptor before they go out on their own. In Canada and Ontario, we go to university for 4 years, and more than half of that time is spent learning practical skills, emergency skills, catching babies, and becoming experts in normal birth. We also make sure to screen you to make sure that a home birth is actually something that is the safest option for you and your baby. During labor, we will keep an eye on you and keep an eye on the baby's heart rate. We are trained to hear things that others can't and see things that others miss. If there's any indication that the norm is changing, we, Paolo, you and me, have a team meeting and we will transfer you to the hospital if that's in your best interest. Okay, so why would we transfer to the hospital, and would we go by ambulance? For starters, most people birth in their intended place, whether that's a hospital, birth center, or home. First-time birthers are, however, often transferred to the hospital more often than those who have had previous babies. But it's usually for something like a really long, tiring labor. So we're looking for pain relief, or sometimes there's some meconium staining and we find in the amniotic fluid or an issue with the baby's heartbeat. So when it comes to a hospital transfer after birth, sometimes this can be more serious. And so reasons for this would be postpartum hemorrhage, maybe a laceration that's more severe, or if we are concerned with the baby. As for ambulance, if you fell into the 8% of first-time birthers who planned to birth at home but needed more assistance for something like a hemorrhage or baby in distress, then you would most likely go by EMS. However, just because we transport you by ambulance doesn't always mean that the situation is emergent. Sometimes using an ambulance is just the most efficient and appropriate way to get to the hospital. And this is also one of the reasons why we want to know how far you live from the hospital, and how on the day of your labor, we're going to keep an eye on things like the weather, what the forecast is, and we will also let the EMS and the hospital know that we have a home birth brewing so that if anything happens, they are prepared. Okay, so Paolo just texted me, and he wants to know what happens if the baby's born and it's not breathing. Do we wait for an ambulance? I'm glad you're asking these questions. Midwives are trained to manage emergencies. We carry a level 1 hospital in the trunk of our cars. Inside our bags, we have sterile instruments, we have oxygen for you and the baby, we have neonatal resuscitation equipment, medications to treat hemorrhage. We are trained by the best in the field to manage all events in all settings, and we regularly get recertified in all levels of emergency management skills, as well as neonatal resuscitation. If there's a true emergency, we call 911 and we continue managing care until the EMS arrives. We continue with you to the hospital, and depending on the situation, you get whisked straight to the appropriate room at the hospital, whether it's an OR or a NICU. We are there with you the entire time. That sounds way less scary now, but do you think my parents and Paolo will believe me when I tell them that for me, a healthy pregnant person, a home birth is considered safe? Okay, well, why don't we schedule an hour visit for your next visit, and you can bring them with you. We can go over everything in more detail and set their minds at ease. An hour? Wow. That's why I tell my friends to get a midwife. The care and dedication is amazing. You are all amazing. That's very sweet. And yes, you're right. Midwives are specialists in healthy, non-complicated pregnancies, and we dedicate our visits to ensuring that you receive the care you deserve. Now, let's book that appointment.